Hello, this Dating the Old Testament video is on the book of Daniel. Let me share my screen here. Daniel is an interesting character. We're familiar with some of the colorful stories about his life, and we're going to talk a little bit about when this book was written. Daniel lived somewhere around about 620 to 535 BC. And the book of Daniel is traditionally understood to have been written by Daniel, so it would be at the tail end of his life, about 535 to 530 BC. So he lives a long time. He's an old man by the time the book is over. It's important for the setting of this book and also to discuss some of the things that Daniel discussed in prophecy, to go over the kingdoms which were present during this time and after Daniel's life. The major world empires, 606 BC, the Babylonians took the first group of exiles from Judea to Babylon, and Daniel was one of them. And the Babylonian Empire lasts till 538 BC, when they're conquered by the Persians. And the Persians last a long time, all the way down to 333 BC, when they run into Alexander the Great and the Greeks. And the Greeks' kingdoms last till 167, although at the end of Alexander's life, he didn't have an heir and the kingdom was divided among his four generals. After that, there was a period of Jewish independence under the Maccabees. It wasn't really the end of the Greek empire, but the Jews gained independence. And then whenever you date the beginning of the Roman Empire, it can be done a couple different ways, but I use 63 AD because that's when the Jews fell under the sway of the Romans, and their Roman Empire goes to a long time in the future, and it can be dated by several different ways. It's ending. 455 is the Vandal sack of Rome. Now, when was the book of Daniel written? The traditional view is that it was written in about 530 BC. That would place it early in the Persian period, after the end of Daniel's life or toward the very end of his life. The alternate view is known as the Maccabean hypothesis, and that places the book of Daniel about 167 to 163 BC. Notice what a very great difference that is. That's a 360-year difference, completely overlapping the gap between the Persian and the Greek empires. A 360-year difference is about like from today going all the way back to the year 1660. So it's a very great difference. And in case you may think that that's sort of an offbeat theory, that the Maccabean hypothesis, it is not. It is the going theory today of when the book was written. Like Wikipedia introduces the book of Daniel by saying the book of Daniel is a 2nd century BCE biblical apocalypse with an ostensible 6th century BCE setting. So Wikipedia supports the Maccabean hypothesis. I think they're wrong. I think the traditional idea that it was written at the end of Daniel's life is the correct one. Why would people support the Maccabean hypothesis? Well, BLUF, that stands for big lead up front. Really, it's because there's an anti-supernatural presupposition on it. You see, Daniel foretells events that took place between 530 and 167 in great detail. It's not like a fortune cookie foretelling. He was very specific. He says things like, the Persian Empire will be followed by the Greek Empire, things like that, which would be unimaginable to write during Daniel's lifetime if God wasn't actually inspiring you. So therefore, an early date requires divine inspiration given to Daniel as a prophet, and people can't really bear that. A lot of the biblical criticism that sometimes has entered into our thinking these days came rather late in the 1800s. But this is a case where the idea that Daniel was written in the Maccabean period was brought up very early. It was first by this fellow named Porphyry of Tyre, who wrote a book called Against the Christians. So you kind of know where he's coming from. And he wrote about Daniel. He said, Daniel was right. Finally, what he told up to Antiochus contained true history. If anything was guessed beyond that point, it was false, for he had not known the future. Commenting on that, Leroy Froome wrote, if the writer was not Daniel, then he lied on a frightful scale, ascribing to God prophecies which were never uttered and making claim of miracles that were never wrought. And if Daniel's authorship could be shown to be false, then Christ himself would be proved to bear witness to an impostor. Now, it wasn't the Antiochus that he's referring to is Antiochus IV, called Epiphanes. He was a Greek Seleucid king, and he's the subject of a little bit in the chapters 8 and 11 of the book of Daniel, and we'll talk about that more later. But I wanted to mention something else. You know, Samuel Rawls Driver was a prominent cleric, and he was a real strong Hebrew scholar. He was one of the authors of the Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, which is still today the go-to lexicon for understanding biblical Hebrew. He argued for the Maccabean hypothesis. I suppose, being a cleric, one might say he was not subject to an anti-supernatural presupposition. I don't really know, but I feel like I need to address several of his arguments. Not that I thought that they were particularly good, but probably should mention them anyway. He points out that in the canon of the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not included in the prophets, but rather in the writings. The Hebrew Bible is divided up into the law, the prophets, and the writings. And the writings are generally assumed to be a later collection than the prophets. Well, the writings aren't all later, but mostly what he says here goes in the category of true but irrelevant. Daniel wasn't really serving in a normal role of a prophet, and that he did not prophesy to the people of Israel. He was mostly an ambassador to pagan kings. Now, in some ways, he is called a prophet by a few people, like Jesus mentions Daniel the prophet, but in any case, it's not much of an argument. Another one is that Ben Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, you can find that book in the Apocrypha if you've got a Catholic Bible. And he wrote about 185 BC, a little before Daniel, and according to the Maccabean hypothesis. And so his chapters 44 to 50 list a number of famous characters from the Bible, but they exclude Daniel. And the implication is that Ben Sirach didn't include Daniel because he didn't know about him. That's a misleading argument, though. Ben Sirach also excludes a lot of other people: Ezra, Job, Mordecai, Jonathan, most of the good kings, and every judge other than Samuel. And if we're going to talk about people mentioning Daniel, Ezekiel does mention Daniel, Ezekiel being a much earlier written book. And then Driver says that the theology of resurrection, ranks of angels, judgment, and Messiah presented in Daniel are late developments in Old Testament history. Well, it may be, some of that may be a little bit late, but most of it's not really true. Isaiah mentions a resurrection. Zechariah has talks with angels. The Messiah and the judgment are really throughout the Bible. Driver offers some other arguments, and I'll kind of get to those as we go along. But I want to talk a little bit about the context of the book of Daniel, the historical context. First, about kings. Daniel had a good relationship with his pagan kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Darius. He seemed to genuinely like them. They liked him. Is this really a model for the Maccabean period? In the Maccabean period, Antiochus was the ultimate bad guy, and the Maccabees wanted to overthrow him and were glad to see him die. So the story of Daniel doesn't really match the environment there of the Maccabean period. Well, we could talk about names. Daniel goes down to Babylon, and he's got three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And those names are all good Hebrew names. I've got their meanings in the second column there, but they're all given new Babylonian names. Daniel is given the name of Belteshazzar. It's not used too much later in the book, but the other three are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and those are the names that the book goes with. Now, those are names of foreign gods. The foreign gods are part of the name. It would be strange if you were trying to write a religious patriotic treatise and you included names of three Hebrew heroes who had foreign gods in their name. So that doesn't really fit the Maccabean period either. Then we should talk about some things that Daniel knew. Keep in mind that if the Maccabean period theory is right, then Daniel was writing, the book is written about another kingdom a thousand miles away and 360 years earlier. So it would be a little surprising if the author knew special things about the culture at that time. But the author does know things like that. For example, the author knows that Babylon had co-ed parties. In other words, men and women at the same party. Well, why would that be surprising? It's because the Persians and the Greeks did not have co-ed parties. Their parties were separated by gender. And so if you were living at the time of the Maccabean period, you've gone hundreds of years without having co-ed parties, so to speak. One other place which this comes up in the Bible is in the book of Esther. In the first chapter, Vashti the queen and Ahasuerus the king, they're having separate, gender separated parties. And Ahasuerus the king tries to call Vashti to come in to his party and she refuses. And that kind of kicks off the whole story of Esther. Some other things that Daniel knew. Babylonian kings could change the laws, but the Persian kings could not. You might remember reading about the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be changed. It's sort of a strange feature, but the author knew about that. Shushan was in the province of Elam. Later it was in its own province. The author knew that Nebuchadnezzar was the builder of New Babylon, which he truthfully brags about. The author knew that the walls in the palace in Babylon were plastered. Walls in Israel were not generally plastered. The methods of execution used in the book, fire and lions, were appropriate to the cultures. You wouldn't use fire in Daniel 6, when Darius the Mede is in charge, because fire was sacred in that Persian Zoroastrian religion. Also, I'm not sure if this goes in the category of something that the author knew, but in Daniel 3:1, King Nebuchadnezzar builds an image which is 60 cubits wide and its breadth 6 cubits in width. And that might hint at something unusual about the Babylonian number system. They didn't have a base 10 number system like we did. They had a base 60 number system. Daniel also knew that Belshazzar was the co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. The Nabonidus is not mentioned in the book of Daniel, but in verse 29 of chapter 5, Belshazzar offers to make Daniel the third ruler in the kingdom. He has to make him third. He can't make him second because he's really co-regent with Nabonidus. So there's the two of them, and he's making Daniel third. Now, Belshazzar was unknown to secular history until 1881, and some of the earlier critics had charged Daniel with a historical inaccuracy, but it was not inaccurate, it was true. By the way, Darius the Mede is still unknown to history. Not every biblical figure is going to be discovered. We should talk about the four kingdoms because they have a bearing on this discussion. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in Daniel chapter 2 of a statue, and Daniel interprets the dream for him and indicates that the parts of the statue are telling about four kingdoms. The first kingdom is a gold head. The second kingdom is a silver chest and arms. The third kingdom is represented by bronze thighs. And the fourth kingdom is represented by iron legs with feet part iron and part clay. And the four kingdoms are replaced finally by the kingdom of God, which comes like a mighty stone and replaces them all and fills the entire world. Now, the identity of those four kingdoms seems pretty obvious. I put it on the timeline earlier in this presentation. You would say Babylon is the first. It has to be the first because Daniel says it is. But the second would be Medo-Persia, the Medes and the Persians. The third would be Greece, and the fourth would be Rome. Well, there's another kingdom vision, and it's in Daniel 7, where the four kingdoms are represented by four beasts. Now, the Maccabean hypothesis just has to mess up the whole story of the kingdoms because they need to get four kingdoms in there prior to 167 BC, leaving Rome out. You see, in 167 BC, Rome was not a major empire. They were still tangled up on the other side of the Mediterranean fighting Carthage. And they hadn't gotten anywhere close to the land of Israel, and they hadn't conquered Greece. So Porphyry, our original critic, said that the four kingdoms are Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then the Ptolemies and the Seleucids being the fourth one. But that doesn't really work because the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were Greek. They were two of the four Greek kingdoms. More contemporary view, the one mostly held today, is that the four kingdoms would be the Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks, followed by the kingdom of God. And it almost hurts to say that because there's just so much wrong with that particular view. First of all, Medes and the Persians. Dividing the Median and Persian kingdoms to say that there were two separate things is historically wrong. But the suggestion is that Daniel had it wrong. But Daniel didn't have it wrong. Daniel had it right. He knew that the Medes and the Persians were together. They're always mentioned together in Daniel, including when Daniel is telling Belshazzar that his kingdom is going to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And when he's reading the writing on the wall, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin, or Perez, the Perez is really a play on words that goes with Persians. The Medes are mentioned first in Daniel. You usually say Medes and Persians because they were the older of the two peoples. Esther, the book written later, puts the Persians first because the Medes had begun to fade in importance. Medo-Persia was an empire that combined the people of the Medes and the Persians, and you can kind of see that even in the visualization of the statue because the arms, there's two arms. The Persians eventually become preeminent, and that's shown also in the bear. That's the second beast. The bear, it said, raised up on one side. Let's talk about the third kingdom. This is the kingdom like a leopard with four wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had four heads. The Maccabean hypothesis says that has to be Persia. The right answer is that this is Greece. The Greek kingdom of Alexander the Great split into four parts upon his death, with each of his four major generals ruling a part. This is well known to history. Those four different parts of the Greek kingdom went on for a long time. So that matches the beast with four heads and four wings. The fourth kingdom, the Maccabean hypothesis, says that that's Greece. And this is a very powerful kingdom, ultimately replaced by the kingdom of God. Now, the right answer is that this is Rome. Now, exactly how the Roman Empire is replaced by the kingdom of God, different Christians might view that a little bit differently based on their particular eschatology. And I don't really need to get into that today on this video, but whether you understand Rome with Jesus Christ coming during the Roman Empire time, or whether you look at it as some sort of future fulfillment, either one works pretty well to understand that the fourth kingdom has got to be Rome. Greece doesn't work at all. In Daniel chapter 8, there's a different kind of vision because this is just a two-beast vision and it doesn't cover all the empires, of course. But this one is very specific because it doesn't just say empire in general or king in general, it names them. In this verse here it says, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So this tells us some things which back up our interpretation of the four kingdom vision. First, it says, the Medes and the Persians are only one animal. They're not separate. Now, the animal has two horns, but it's just one animal. The Greek breakup into four kingdoms is clearly stated. The first Greek king is obviously Alexander the Great. Now, the Maccabean hypothesis says that the emphasis of the book really lies with Antiochus at the end of things, but that doesn't work all the time. For instance, they would like to make Antiochus one of the figures in Daniel 9, where it says the people of the prince who is to come will destroy Jerusalem and the temple. But Antiochus did not do that. Rome did do that. So understanding Rome as the last kingdom, this is another reason why that works a little bit better. And while parts of Daniel 11 do match the life of Antiochus, the latter part of the chapter does not match his life. And finally, I don't want to talk too much about language, but Driver made a big point about it, and he was a prominent scholar. He says, this is a quote, the Greek words demand, the Hebrew supports, and the Aramaic permits a date after the conquest of Palestine by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Now, Daniel, the book of Daniel is written in the first chapter, and then the last some chapters are written in Hebrew, and some of the middle is written in Aramaic. And so that's what he's talking about there. And I think that what he says here is really kind of wrong through and through, even based on what he had available to him. But like I said before, he was a prominent Hebrew scholar. His life ended before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I am wondering if he would have said that if he'd had a chance to study them, because they surely don't really support it. They don't seem to support it to me. But I did want to just offer one thing up, which could kind of be understood by folks here, even without understanding Hebrew or Aramaic, and that's that it was important to Driver that there were 3 Greek words in the book of Daniel, and indeed there are. They're all musical instruments in Daniel chapter 3. And so he felt that was evidence that this was written at the tail end of the Greek period. But musical instruments are nouns that travel. It doesn't prove very much. You know, it's like a pizza. That's an Italian word, but we use it in the English language. And if a musical instrument was imported into a foreign court, you could get a Greek word even in an earlier period. However, in the book of Daniel, there's also 18 Persian words. So if you think about the Maccabean hypothesis being written at around about 167 BC, that's more than 160 years after the Persians were done and gone. So if there's 18 Persian words and there's 3 Greek words, does the evidence indicate that the book was written in the Greek period or the Persian period? It's 18-3, folks. I think that gives pretty good evidence that the book of Daniel, even from a linguistic standpoint, was written in the Persian period. There's as always, I have a fair amount more I could say about this that's covered in my book, Dating the Old Testament. If anybody wants to read more about the subject, I would point you to that book. And thank you for listening. I'll come back with another video soon.